All right, guys, exactly one person has asked, so we're going to do it. This is going to be a video all about the suspension, the skid plates, the tires, the off-road hardware, if you will, of this truck. So we're going to first measure the suspension heights in all the different modes. It's important to know that the suspension in the front, independent suspension, as the wheels come up and down, they also come in and out a little bit, right? Because this arm's going to come down, it's going to swing, so they need to come in and out. So if you just go from the highest setting to the lowest setting, and you don't let the truck roll at all and let the wheels settle, it'll kind of hold it up higher. You notice that a lot with the side-by-sides, right? If you jack up a Talon or a YXZ and you set it down, it'll be 5 inches higher than if you rolled it a couple feet. So this was in normal mode. I just put in entry-exit mode. We're going to measure it, and then we're going to drive it in and out of the garage once, measure it again, and see if there's a difference there. I suspect the rear won't change, and the front will change maybe a little bit. So the points we're going to measure from to be consistent are these holes on the front bumper, license plate mount holes. Let me make my tape measure a little higher. Get it out of the way of the bumper. And we'll just do the ones on the passenger side to be consistent. We'll measure to the bottom of that hole. Okay, so that's 17 1/4 up front. Pretty good. That's kind of an annoying spot to measure, but I think it's the best we got. So 17 1/4. And in the rear, we have a much easier thing to measure too, which is the hitch. 15 1/8. Okay, so now we're going to drive it in and out and see if that changes. Don't worry, I'll put all this in a spreadsheet to summarize it. And in the front, we're still at, we dropped down a little bit. We're like right at the bottom of the holes, right at 17. So there you go. Okay, so that's entry exit after letting the suspension settle. Now we're going to go to the opposite extreme. We're going to go to off-road mode, which should be, according to the manual, 4 inches higher. We'll do that, and then we'll also, again, let the suspension settle. So let me show you what it looks like when it goes into off-road mode. You do have to have the engine running to raise the truck because it has to run the compressor, and you have to have all the doors closed. So get in here, start the truck, and then you just hit this button, which will be 3 times because we need to go all the way up from the lowest setting, and it'll say raising right there. And you can look, hold the phone steady and you can see my little thing. See the truck going up? We're getting closer to touching the little bunny. Someone did also comment yesterday that if I turn on tow haul mode and traction control off, it should be totally disabled and I can do donuts and stuff. So I might have to test that feature out a little bit today too. Off-road, ride height achieved. This is off-road mode with the suspension settled. The front does look higher to me. We'll see the tape measure though. The compressor did kick on to re-level the truck after I got out of it. So the other modes are normal mode, which is 1 inch lower than this, front and rear allegedly, and then aero mode, which is another 0.6 inches lower than that. So this is pretty interesting. I know that was a lot of talking, but to summarize, the front of the truck travels a lot more than the manual would have you believe, and the rear of the truck travels less. I want to repeat this exact test on a non-off-road or an off-road. So Robert, need to borrow your truck again, or do this when I come over. But pretty interesting results that you can get 5.5 more inches of ground clearance under the differential in off-road mode than you can in entry-exit mode. Hey guys, so I went through and made this little nifty spreadsheet. These down here are the results. So let me explain the results first, then we'll get into the summary at the top. Front and rear measurements, and then static and settled. Static is the measurement just after pressing the button. Settled is after moving the truck back 10 feet and forward 10 feet. The settled number is much more relevant. I just included the static one on here to show that there is a difference between letting your suspension settle and not. Another thing to note is you see that there's a big difference between entry and settled for off-road, right? That's because it depends, or in the front there is, in the rear, not so much. And that's because it depends on how much of the suspension range it has to go through. I went all the way from entry exit to off-road, which as you can see is a greater than 4 inch change in the front. And that means that the settling made a big difference in the front. If I'd only gone from off-road to normal, it wouldn't have been that big of a delta. And that's the same thing I was talking about earlier, where you need to let the suspension settle because the track width changes. And if the track width can't change because the tires are in one spot, it'll kind of prop the suspension up or hold it down, vice versa. The static measurements also aren't super relevant because we didn't go in order. We went from entry to off-road and then back down. And the static differences will change based on the direction you arrived at them from. And like I just said, based on the mode you were in previously. So don't pay too much attention to the static numbers. Those are just there to show that there is a difference between letting your suspension settle. The actual results of this test are the settled numbers. So those are the measurements down here, which I took from the video. You see that they're in decimal points here and not in fractions of an inch. I actually used the video to recalculate them because the camera had a better angle reading the tape measure than my eyeball. So these are probably more accurate than the numbers I was saying out loud. So the manual says that in entry-exit mode, you're at 0. So I put that as truth all the way across. When the truck's at the very bottom, entry-exit mode, that is 0 front and rear. And then I went through to calculate the deltas from that. Just did a formula in here to subtract. So if we click on this cell, that's out of the manual. That doesn't have it. Click on this cell. It's just your settled minus your arrow settled minus your entry settled will give you your settled measurement, right? So basically just the delta from 0. So same thing all the way down. We just keep subtracting from the entry height. And then for these over here, which like I said, don't matter, we did the same thing. We just used the static numbers. Okay, so the results. This is really interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and hide these columns because, like I said, they don't matter. So the craziest thing here is that this truck has 5.5 inches of adjustable suspension travel, not total travel, but you can change the height of the front of the truck 5.5 inches. That is a huge amount. The manual says it's only 4 inches. Actually, does the manual say approximately 4 inches? I am looking at it right now. It says approximately 26 millimeters for off-road 1, and then approximately 73 millimeters for entry-exit from 3. So yeah, the manual says about 4 inches. 5.5 is pretty far from 4. So that's really interesting. What I want to do now is I want to borrow my buddy's non-off-road and see if he has a 5.5 inch range of travel in the front. Looking at his before, I suspect it does. The reason I did this test because I was pretty sure the front of the truck was moving more than 4 inches, and I was right. So when you go into aero mode from entry mode, it lifts the front of the truck 3.35 inches from 0. That's a lot. Not really sure why it moves that much. I'd like it to ride a little bit lower for gas mileage and stuff, but that's the biggest jump is from entry to aero is 3.35 inches. You go to off-road, it raises up, how much is that? 0.65 inches, which is actually accurate. The manual says it will raise up 0.6 inches from aero to normal. And then when you go from normal to off-road, it's a 1.5 inch increase in the front. The manual tells you that that is only a 1 inch increase. So that's pretty interesting. In the rear, you don't have as much travel. There's only a 3 inch change throughout the entire thing, really 2.9 inches, which kind of makes sense because the rear has to have additional load leveling capacity. So this is it just moving the truck unloaded, but it has to try to maintain that with a trailer hooked up or an ATV in the bed. So it kind of makes sense that the rear doesn't have as much adjustability. Also, the rear adjustability isn't as relevant because the rear is a solid axle, so you're not getting more ground clearance by adjusting the rear. You're getting a little more breakover angle and departure angle, but the solid axle doesn't care about where it is in the travel as far as ground clearance. So anyways, on the rear, when you go from entry to exit, you only go up 1.1 inches. So I suspect what Dodge was doing here in the manual is kind of averaging these deltas. And maybe I'll go ahead and do that so we can see what that difference is. And see if that matches the manual better. If I could type, that would help. Average these two, drag that down. So that's pretty funny. If you do the average of them, it matches the manual almost exactly. So 0 to 4 inches, that's what the manual says. And then it says that this comes up 3 inches, so that doesn't quite match. But this is about 0.6 of an inch. That's really 0.7, 0.8 of an inch higher. So I suspect that's what the manual did. They were averaging front to rear. The manual doesn't give you, front to rear specific heights. So that's probably what's going on there. But anyways, I digress. So arrows an inch higher in the rear than the front. Arrows an inch higher than entry exit mode. Normal's 2 inches and off-road's 3 inches. Still a lot of adjustability. Putting it in entry exit mode will definitely make it easier to load a four-wheeler in the back. But you can kind of see that the back and the front do pretty different things. Another thing that's interesting is the delta between the two of them. So let's see if it's actually trying to change the angle of the truck to help with gas mileage. So we'll just do a little formula and subtract them. Give us the deltas. I did this wrong. Let's try that again. This minus this is still going to be 0, but now everything will line up. So the deltas between the two of them. So this one's 2 inches off. This one's 2 inches, 2.2. This one's 2.6. Not a huge difference, I guess. It's pretty consistent as far as the deltas go. You know, if you look between normal and aero mode, so normal and aero are the two modes that you can drive along the highway. We'll bold those. So if you look between these two, the front changes about 0.65 inches. The rear changes 0.9 inches. So what does that really mean? I don't know. It drops the back of the truck a little more than the front, maybe to get the tailgate out of the wind. But, you know, we're talking fractions of an inch here, nothing huge. But I'm sure Dodge did do some kind of something smart there when you put in aero mode to try to help you get better gas mileage. So it kind of rakes the truck back a little bit. If anything, it kind of Carolina squats it, which is disgusting. But don't worry, guys. We're only talking like a quarter of an inch.